this episode of the People's History Show, we're here in Canada, where we'll be looking at the story of Scots settlers who helped build the Canadian nation we see today. I'm standing here on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, the nation's capital, the powerhouse of Canada, and this just demonstrates how much of a thriving nation Canada is today. Scots have played a huge part in that history, but what do we know about our ancestors who travelled here in the early 1800s? What challenges did they face? And how did one Scot in particular establish that? I'm David Farrel, and I've travelled across the Atlantic to find the true story of the first Scots who came to Canada to establish not only a new life, but also a new country. Coming up, we'll be visiting the town of Scots descendants who still hold their heritage close to their heart.
Even though I'm full-blooded Canadian, I would say that I'm 75% Scottish.
I get sentimental.
We'll be learning about the pioneer who turned a formidable wilderness into a thriving economic region. And this is still all in the family?
It's still all in the family, so it's been in the Davidson name for well over 200 years.
And we'll be examining the controversial Glaswegian who brought Canada together as its first Prime Minister.
He was a man who worked the political system and did it very, very, very well.
But first, we're travelling to the deep woods of the Maritime Provinces, where most Scots would have first landed in Canada hundreds of years ago. When Scots travelled across the Atlantic in search of a new life, the dream promised was often far from reality. Rob Gilmore works here in the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick, where one story in particular might shed some light on the realities many faced.
So this was the proposed town of Stanley to be used in Scotland to promote this area that they were trying to bring settlers to. Because it says it is the sketch of the proposed town, it was done in 1834 when they were just putting this company together. But there was a group that came over late in 1836, mostly drawn from the Isle of Skye. They came later in the year. They were sent to an area which became known as the Scotch settlement.
Stuart Douglas knows the area, including the location of the Skye settlement.
We will follow this, generally follow this Dunbar stream in for about 8 kilometers. And then we will go almost due north, and then they come up here to this height of land. And this is where these settlers came to try to make a living in the middle of the woods, middle of nowhere. It is a long, rough road and a dusty road, but we've been there before, we can make it.
They petitioned the New Brunswick government in 1837, telling of their experience. I mean, they talk about here, they were promised 100 acres to each family with 5 acres cleared and under crops and a comfortable log house thereon, and they underlined the comfortable. Your petitioners were sent out to the company's settlement in the month of November and December, were put in the most miserable hovels.
How far are we from the nearest road?
The way we come in, we're probably about 18 kilometers.
18 kilometres, so that's it's taken us about 25 minutes by car.
Well, there's a cairn put there in 1984.
So this is to remember all these Scots.
First winter have had their wives and little ones lying for several successive days in their beds covered with snow, so much so that a most fatal disease was brought on among your petitioners and their neighbors, whereby upwards of 40 men, women, and children died.
When I was first out here as a teenager, this was all wooded, completely wooded.
Are these settlers buried here?
They were actually buried here, yes.
And this is...
Those are the names of some of the settlers.
That's a very Scottish list of names.
It is, yeah. And there's still quite a few of those names in the area.
Yeah?
The second one from the bottom on the left.
So that's your great-great-grandfather?
Great-grandfather, yeah.
Oh. And what we see around about us just now is obviously a cleared area. Try and paint a picture for us of what your great-great-grandfather would have faced, what would have literally been in front of him.
What would have been in front of them? Just what you see in over here, just woods.
Thick with trees.
Trees, yeah.
And were there houses for them?
There were supposed to be houses, there were buildings, but there were more shacks than buildings, I understand.
And what kind of houses were these? Were these?
These were wooden structures, but they were very rudimentary.
So they were given houses with cellars, but houses with no doors? Or
Yes, I understand, no doors, no windows, and they were given boards later on to build their own doors and windows. These are fishermen from Skye.
Yeah, this is not what they're used to at all.
That's what they're used to as well.
And on this plaque here, it commemorates a lone inhabitant. Who's that?
Inhabitant was one Maisie MacDonald, who didn't leave the area when all the others did. She stayed there on her own and lived there.
41 people died that winter. Children, women, men. My father was one of them. In the spring, many of the families moved somewhere else. But my mother stayed, my older brothers, and we made do.
This is a book that was kept by the New Brunswick and Nova Scotia Land Company, in which each one of the settlers was listed if they still owed money. It's interesting, there's a note here that says that it's no use to try to get anything from her as far as further monies because she is a pauper. And the land all burnt over as stony and dry, which kind of speaks to the quality maybe of the area that they were being sent to. She was a survivor, there's no question. When many others left the settlement, the MacDonalds stuck it out.
I never wanted to leave. I felt that I belonged here. This was my place. This is my home.
But it does make me wonder how valued, how thought of were our Scottish ancestors when they were given this land back in the 1800s and told, make a living, you're thrown away up in the forest in the middle of nowhere in a land that you don't know. If it was me stepping off a boat after 40 odd days across the Atlantic and you're faced with a wall of trees, I certainly couldn't even get that far.
So this wasn't the only settlement, and the attempt to set up a large settlement of Scottish settlers. There was one in the 1870s upriver in Victoria County, Kincardine, Kintore areas.
My name's Rose Morton. I'm an archivist here, a public service archivist at the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick. This book are the Executive Council minutes, and in it we see that there's a petition for a settlement that they are going to be calling Stonehaven in this petition, where Captain Brown wants to bring over a group of settlers from Kincardine in Scotland to settle this land.
About 700 immigrants came from northeast Scotland to this community right here and established it. There's 4 communities. There's Upper Kintore, Lower Kintore, Kincardine, where we are now, and Bonaccord.
Garth, another fantastic view in this part of the world, but what can we see behind us?
Right behind us and to our right is all part of the Scotch colony. In the far horizon is the United States,
Wow.
the state of Maine.
So from here, right over there, we've got America.
Yes,
And then a little taste of Scotland
exactly.
right here.
There are stories of settlements that weren't able to survive those first few winters, but Kincardine did and is still a vibrant community.
My grandfather on my father's side was 1 year old when they came here in 1874 on the Sidonian, and they came from Echt, Scotland, just outside of Aberdeen. It's a little crossroad.
Hi there, how you doing? I'm David.
We're going to Upper Kintore where I lived, and then we're going to have supper, and we'll be back here to the Burns Hall for a concert.
It's turning into a little Burns night is what it's turning into.
Okay.
Well, everybody's there and the fiddlers are there to play for the dances. We may as well do some dances. We're doing the military glide and we're going to do the heel and toe polka and we're going to do the Highland schottish and the gay Gordon and we'll do the Virginia reel, which is also called Strip the Willow.
Strip the Willow, yeah.
The older folks know them, and we're passing them on. You know, we don't want these to die out. Are you musical?
No, I can't dance either, so this is going to be fun.
You must be able to keep in time. Can you keep
Yeah,
time?
we
Do you
can
have
get
a
there,
beat?
yeah.
Okay, well then good.
Yeah.
We can teach you.
I'll follow the lead. I'll be fine. Kate, you've just been up on stage with the pipe band. What's that like?
Well, this is a stage I've been on many, many times. I did my first little vocal solo when I was 3 years old, just a little tot. Of course, you've met my mother. She had us all on stage at a very early age. It's kind of like a secret little Scottish club that we have going on.
We like this secret Scottish club. And a lot of people, well, how important do you think it is to keep that Scottish heritage alive here?
I think it's really, really important. Nice to see some new kids. There are a lot of new kids who moved into the area lately, and Mom and the rest of the community have kind of like drawn them in to immerse them in the Scottish culture and dance and music and all kinds of stuff. So really enjoying it and seeing you'll see the kids dancing afterwards, and it's a lot of fun.
I have seen Helen every year at the Highland Games in Fredericton. She's always teaching Gaelic.
I would say that I'm 75% Scottish. With the traditions that we uphold in our family, even though I'm full-blooded Canadian, my whole tradition and my whole culture is centered around Scotland.
And if you think about it, say approximately 700 people in 1873 and 1874, 6 or 7 generations ago, that would multiply now into hundreds of thousands of people of Scottish descent that all started here and can trace the roots back to Scotland.
Do you feel quite proud about that?
I certainly do.
How proud do you feel about your own Scottish heritage?
Very.
Yeah?
And I get sentimental.
That's good. It's an emotion. It is your family. It's your history. Is it an emotion that comes from pride and?
Yeah.
After the break, we'll be learning about some of the standout Scots who pioneered the beginnings of a new nation here in Canada. In this episode of the People's History Show, we've been exploring the story of Scots who crossed the Atlantic to start a new life here in Canada. First, we're travelling to the valley of the Miramichi River in New Brunswick. When I look out across this river, I can't help but feel transported back to the 18th century and get a sense of what Scots who travelled here then would have faced, because you look out at this river, it's so wild, it's just massive. I wouldn't imagine this to have been too different to what 18th century Scots would have faced when they first landed here. How do you set up a new life, a new world, and what kind of person can do that? One Scot, William Davidson, a 25-year-old from Aberdeenshire, thought he was the man to not only make a new life here on the Miramichi, but transform it into an economic powerhouse. And descendants of William Davidson still live in Canada today.
So this is where my grandfather lived, and when my grandfather came
over there
in this house here. So my grandfather and grandmother raised 4 children in this house. To my immediate left, you can see the southwest branch of the Miramichi River. And part of the property actually is this unique little structure on my left. That's part of William's son's house.
So your grandfather was in there?
Yes.
And
my great-great-great-great-great grandfather was over the hill by the river. So William Davidson came here with a pioneering and entrepreneurial spirit, and I would be an 8th or 9th generation descendant of William Davidson on my mother's side. I was a little older and I started to think of it and then realized actually what Davidson did. Coming here at a young age of 25 and basically like an entrepreneur, pioneer, bringing settlers, doing all the things that he did in a very short period of time with that spirit of adventure. And it does make you proud and realize that, you know, everything that we see and I know of on the Miramichi basically sprouted from his ideas, his ideals, his philosophies. And William Davidson's homestead was basically right there, right beside the river. And one of his first ventures was fishing. So this is that preferred site that he came to because the river was a little narrower, reminded him of home in Scotland. So this is where he said he was going to settle.
Yeah.
But just at that time, to venture that far, and again, the equipment and everything he would have needed to bring here in order to start to build a home and clear a property. It's quite incredible.
And this is still all in the family?
It's still all in the family, so it's been in the Davidson name for well over 200 years.
So how do you feel when you stand here in the middle of the Davidson estate, if you like?
When I knew it younger, I mean, this was an incredible place for a child to grow up. But then, of course, through my grandmother and grandfather, heard the stories of William and what happened, you know, when he came here and when he lived here. And always that appreciation for how difficult it would have been for him and the others, you know, simply to start and clear this land.
Yeah.
He began settling the area. He entered several ventures from fishing, forestry, lumber and logging, shipbuilding, and he really shaped, I think, the culture, the economy, the society that we see that continued on, that's currently in the Miramichi and in the province and in the country today.
So what was it about the Miramichi River that attracted Davidson to this part of the world? The answers lie on the river itself. Brad, we're on the Miramichi. Where are we heading?
So we're heading to Beaubears Island, which would have been on the easterly portion of the land that was granted to William Davidson and John Court. Davidson was well aware of probably the bounty of the fish that were in the waters, the lumber, and just the great potential that was here on the river because of the huge, vast natural resources that were available.
And Brad, there was a specific type of tree on this island that was quite important to Davidson.
There was a unique tree, not only to the island but to the region, and that was the white pine. And it was very valued because of its strength, the clarity of the wood, how straight the wood was, and it was an ideal selection for making masts for tall ships at the time. Transportation around the world on the ocean was by tall ships, so they needed tall, straight masts, and the white pine fit the bill.
Brad, we're right in the middle of the forest on Beaubears, and this is a classic white pine.
That's correct. It is a classic white pine, and behind this white pine we're in a small grove or a stand of white pine. If you notice the tree itself, there's very few branches until you get fairly far up.
Pretty straight up as well.
Very, very straight, and that was the attraction. If you look at several of them around here, gun barrel straight, but then there would have been just the incredible amount of hard manual labor in order to cut and saw this down and then transport it to the water's edge.
But here, Davidson was a supplier to the shipbuilding
industry. He was a supplier, and then the people that came after Davidson took over where he was and so continued to supply lumber and things to the shipbuilding industry.
Well, actually, we're standing on what would have been a slipway.
That's right. The gentleman that came after him engaged in a very active shipbuilding enterprise here. And I believe they had 5 pits on the island here where they were able to construct ships, and they simply rolled them out of here when the water was higher into the water.
For Davidson, money did grow on trees here.
Money did grow on trees in the Miramichi watershed for William Davidson.
Behind me, right over there, is the final resting place of William Davidson. He came over from Scotland in the 18th century and has set this place up for the rest of its life here in New Brunswick. And the area that he's buried in just now, he's joined by other Scottish settlers who probably would have followed him over round about the same time. And until fairly recently, this forest was an overgrown mess, and the Scottish Heritage Society of the Miramichi have restored this place to the respectful resting area that it is. And I think that shows now how important Scottish heritage is here in Canada. Many thousands of Scots followed in the footsteps of those like Davidson over many years, making a life off the land. From fishing on rivers like the Miramichi to travelling further west to the frontiers, all whilst contending with a land which was truly a world away from Scotland. But Scots did more than just survive in the New World. In that wave of Scots that came to Canada in the 1800s, there was one Glaswegian in particular who was instrumental in the country that Canada would become. I've come to the capital, Ottawa, where that Scot, Sir John A. Macdonald, succeeded in bringing Canada together for the very first time as its first Prime Minister.
Call in progress.
Well, this is a pretty significant home for Canadians, given that our first Prime Minister lived here. The house is the British High Commissioner to Canada's primary residence, official residence. So she lives here with her family, and it has been home to the British High Commissioner since 1930. The house was built in 1855, Sir Johnny MacDonald moved in 1882. The bedroom upstairs on the second floor was where Sir Johnny MacDonald lived and slept every night, and also where he passed away in 1891.
So this is the room that this was his bedroom
exactly.
in this very grand house. To be honest, not the biggest room I would have expected.
No, he certainly didn't give himself pride of place in the house. It's not that large a room considering his stature.
And what about him as a politician, because he played a very important part in Canada's history?
He was very much a technocrat. He wasn't a general. He was not a great dictator or leader. Now, that's not to say he couldn't be devastatingly partisan, and he couldn't be very cruel and Machiavellian when he needed to be. There's this emergent view that portrays him as, possibly racist, as someone who was very Anglo, narrow-minded, Eurocentric, and that vision of him that's emerging, and certainly he said some very racist things during his lifetime, and you cannot paper that over. It kind of runs counter, though, to the narrative of Sir Johnny as unifier. He brought people together from different parties, from different backgrounds, and certainly from different languages and ethnic groups to be part of his coalition. And I think he probably would have bristled at the notion of him being the masthead, the singular hero. He was a man who worked the political system as the political system and did it very, very, very well.
My name is Gary Lados Corneille. I'm an interpretation officer with the Parliamentary Tours Division of the Library of Parliament. And we're here especially in East Block because in the 1870s this was the Power Building. This is where the Governor General, the Prime Minister, and the Ministers of the Crown would have had their offices. So welcome to the office of Sir John A. Macdonald here in the East Block building of the Parliament of Canada. This office is set in the period of the 1870s, specifically 1872, 5 years after the Confederation of Canada in 1867.
And let's talk about MacDonald and his involvement in the Confederation. He was instrumental, wasn't he?
It was his child, if you will. The record shows that he was an extremely passionate person. It was basically his idea to take the separate colonies that made up the original provinces of Canada and form them into this federation of different cultures and different geographic areas to come together and make a country.
Lately, because there's been so much reevaluation of Sir John A. Macdonald's role in Confederation and in the founding of the country, whereas we used to see him as sort of this cartoon hero, now we're starting to have more debate about him, and that's good.
So there we have it. Not only were Scots key to settling this part of the world, but they played such an important role in building the nation that we see today. It's something we should all be proud of, and from what we've seen, that bond should only get stronger.